Right. Looks like a video is up. Go ahead and get started. Good evening, everyone. This is an Ask a Planner event for the Midtown St. Albans area plan. My name is Hannah Reckow. I'm a planner with the Raleigh Planning and Development Department. Also joined today by Jason Harden, also a planner with the city, who's also the project manager for the Midtown St. Albans area plan. If you're joining us tonight, you may have participated earlier in this process. We'll talk more about the next steps a little later in the evening, but where we are right now is a draft plan report and recommendations have been published, and the City Council has asked the Planning Commission to review those recommendations. So next week, the Commission will be holding a public meeting to discuss the recommendations and hear feedback and input. The intent of tonight's meeting is to answer your questions about the plan and the recommendations. I'll say this is the first virtual meeting of this kind that we've had, so bear with us through the new technology, but I also want to stress it's not your only opportunity to ask questions. You can always reach out to us via email or phone. So I'm going to hand it over to Jason in a moment to talk through the plan process and recommendations. We'll then turn to your questions, starting with some of the ones we've already received in advance, and then any questions you have during the meeting. I'm going to go through a few housekeeping items first so we all know what to expect. So on the public input page that you're viewing this meeting from, you should see a comment box. You can use that box to ask questions throughout the meeting. We'll be keeping an eye on it. There are also a few other options for asking questions above the screen. So there's a phone number and a meeting code. You can use that to call in and either leave us a voicemail or join a queue and we'll take your question live. There's also an email address that you can use to email in questions. And then the last note I have is just as a heads up, we do have some technical support behind the scenes helping us. So we may, at a few points in the meeting, check in with her regarding what messages received, if any callers are in the queue, and appreciate your patience with that. All right, so with that, I'll hand it off to Jason, who can give us an overview.
Thanks, Hannah. So I'm going to be relatively brief. I'm going to try to strike a balance between providing a little bit of context about the plan and the recommendations and how we got here. But at the same time, I know many of you may be pretty familiar with it, so I don't want to go in too much detail and I want to leave lots of room for questions. And if I do go relatively fast past something and you want to talk about it more, that's the point of this, so we can go back and explore it in more detail. But I did want to give us all a level starting point for understanding what we're going to talk about tonight. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and go through some slides. Okay, you should be able to see the slide now, showing the area for the plan that we've worked on. Double check and make sure that is the case. Hannah, are you able to see that?
Yes, I can.
So the plan area is centered on North Hills and 440 and Wake Forest Road, but it does extend a little bit in each direction. So up to Millbrook Road in the north, Six Forks Road in the west, Atlantic Avenue on the east, and then the Crabtree Creek and Six Forks Road on the south. And the original direction and the prime goal of the plan was to look at infrastructure improvements. There's been a lot of development in this area, and there will continue to be more. And looking at ways to make sure that that's adequately served in terms of transportation or stormwater or public space and parks improvements. And that was the core of the plan. It also takes a look at some other issues that we heard were important during the plan process, which has been pretty extensive. Actually began back in 2018, at least with initial, what we call visioning, which is the idea of understanding what it is that we ought to be taking a look at. We did hear from a lot of people at the start of the process, but we heard from more and more as we got into it, and it expanded the scope a little bit. So when we got into the substance of the plan, we had three big, I wouldn't say events, we had event phases with multiple events designed to be easy for people to participate in, and also a lot of online engagement. The final report was published earlier this year. There was what we called a confirmation group, which is a group of residents and other stakeholders who were involved in making sure that the outreach process was robust and that the final results did indeed reflect what we heard during the planning process. And I'll talk at the end about next steps. Did want to go through a couple of highlights about the process. We did aim to be very inclusive. We had what I think was the city's first all Spanish language planning meeting, which was an exciting event for us, and did a lot of outreach to let people know. And I'm sure there may be some people who are coming to this fresh, but did want to make sure that people had lots of opportunities to hear about it and play a part in the plan. So what we heard, and we heard a lot, I'm going to just talk about a few highlights, but the biggest theme overall was walkability, that it's absolutely a must. People know, people see lots of destinations in the area, North Hills, the Greenway, lots of educational and employment destinations, but it's awfully hard to get there because the area is just chopped up, not just by 440, but some of the other big roads. And we heard that people would really love to be able to walk there, to work, for recreation, whatever the reason. That was something that was a consistent theme throughout the process. So at multiple points, we heard that was the top issue to address. Also heard a lot of concerns about traffic on neighborhood streets. So there are some pretty significant recommendations to address that. Preserving or ensuring that new development is matches and respects the scale of existing residential neighborhoods was a big one. Stormwater reduction, housing affordability, parks and open space, streetscape improvements, getting around by car. There were a lot of issues that we heard were pretty important. We boiled that down, or the plan boiled that down in the end to 5 key principles. Midtown moves. That's the idea of ensuring healthy, safe, and reliable transportation. That can mean more than just, and does mean more than just driving. The ability to choose different ways of getting around and to think about carbon emissions as well. Transportation is a huge source of that. So the ability to give people options that also produce less air pollution and carbon was really important. Midtown living, we heard about housing affordability, housing choice. People continue to move to Raleigh, to the region, for the opportunities that it provides, jobs, education, just the chance to live in a diverse and welcoming city. And that's going to continue. And so we heard from a lot of people that housing opportunities are important. Midtown works, a similar idea, but with employment opportunities and ensuring that people have an opportunity to get to work in a place that's becoming a center. Aesthetics, streetscaping, parks, trees, all that important. And then finally, what we call Midtown green and blue, which is the idea that there are a lot of existing creeks and waterways that are not necessarily at the foreground in how we experience Midtown, and can do more as natural spaces, can do more as active transportation, that people can get around in ways that allow them to experience nature. So implementing the principles boil down to what we call 7 big moves, which are, what I like to say, the big idea is that if you understand these, you understand the whole plan. And I'm going to go through each of these again pretty quickly, and I will be happy to take questions if there are some. So number 1, I talked about the Beltline as a barrier. It's certainly, it's the reason the area exists in the first place. It does a lot to move people around the region, a lot of economic benefit, but it's a big barrier in the area. So The plan recommends 2 new bridges across the Beltline. One would be a multimodal bridge for cars and a greenway connection, people walking or biking in between Six Forks and Wake Forest. That takes a lot of the transportation demand off those interchanges at Six Forks and Wake Forest with the Beltline. The second one is just a bicycle and pedestrian crossing a little bit further to the east, which would connect Wake Tech and the Midtown East, the Wegmans area across the Beltline where there's growing demand for trips. Green streets, that's the idea. I talked about a strong demand or need to address the traffic in neighborhood streets. Green streets do a couple of different things by adding green stormwater infrastructure to the streets. So slowing traffic on some of these very wide streets like Quail Hollow. Also beautifying neighborhoods, talked about aesthetics, adding some greenery to these very wide pieces of asphalt, collecting stormwater, and providing safer spaces, as you see in the picture there, for people walking or biking. When it comes to infrastructure, this is a big part of it. One of the reasons why sometimes there can be some congestion in the area is there's not a particularly robust grid of streets. There's the Beltline and a couple of other streets, and that's it. So essentially every trip gets funneled into those very few streets. And the plan's recommendation is to create a much more resilient and extensive grid of streets. These would be done in different ways. Some of these, and I know we've gotten some questions about this, a few of them would be city capital projects where the city goes in and acquires land and builds the project, as in the case of the bridge. Others would be dependent on development. So typically, if there's an apartment building or an office building, that's not something where the city is going to just knock that down and put a road through there. So it would be, as those areas see new development, that's when the opportunities come to create that grid. What the plan calls serious transit. So obviously there's transit serving the area right now. It's low frequency. It is not highly used, and that's partly because of the frequency. So a lot of transit improvements on the way for routes that are what we call frequent. So 15 minutes or less, which is where people stop having to worry about, did I just miss the bus or when is the bus coming? Because it's essentially always about to come. And so 3 15-minute routes to downtown, to North Carolina State, and then a circumferential route around the Beltline to Crabtree to the west and Wake Med to the east. And in the future, the possibility of bus rapid transit, which is where buses have some of their own space on the roads and essentially have a service that some people call light rail on wheels. It can be at that same level. The Midtown Ring, I mentioned that there was a huge desire to improve walkability. In fact, the final plan document itself ended up being called Walkable Midtown because that was such a theme. And so the recommendation here, because some of those main roads, Wake Forest, Six Forks, are fairly wide, and they can get better, and they will get better. But for that true walkability, what this plan recommends is a whole separate network of safe, comfortable places for people to walk or ride a bicycle. It builds on the Crabtree Greenway, but also connects north across the Beltline on the bicycle pedestrian bridge that I mentioned, and essentially forms a loop around all the key destinations of the area and a new Greenway connection coming down again across the Beltline on that second bridge and meeting back with the Crabtree Greenway to the south. And some important spurs to connect to North Hills and north to the neighborhoods along Quail Hollow on one of the green streets to make sure that this is something that's accessible to everybody in the region. And an example of what this kind of, this would be more along the Crabtree, what this kind of facility can look like and what it looks like if there are more uses that address the waterfront rather than turn their back. And that leads to thinking about land use, and one of the big moves, thinking about in a few key locations, looking at future land uses, not changing existing zoning. This would be a guide to future rezonings, but looking at places where housing and employment opportunities would be valuable, looking at ways to incentivize more affordable housing while still ensuring that there's some gentle transitions between some of these taller mixed use areas and lower scale existing residential areas. And then lastly, what we're calling the Midtown waterfront district. So for so long, this area has turned its back essentially on the Crabtree Creek. There are parking lots, there are abandoned buildings, vacant warehouses, and just not a lot of activity there. And yet it has the opportunity to be an incredible resource for Midtown and for the city as a whole. And the concept is to reverse, again, that situation and create a waterfront park that does two things. It creates something that Raleigh doesn't have, which is an urban, vibrant, lively place next to a waterway, but also does a lot to do stormwater control. It would be a resilient, what we call a resilient park space that can hold a lot of stormwater when it gets wet, which it sometimes does, but also would be just a beautiful gathering place for people in the region. And this is a concept of where that park could go. It's a long range kind of concept, but it's something that can begin to be implemented relatively quickly. So I'm gonna just have a few more slides. I feel like I've talked a lot and I wanna get to your questions. And this is definitely too much detail, I think, to convey very quickly. But did wanna note that I talked about the future land use map amendments. There are a couple places, generally looking at ways to allow more, as I mentioned, housing opportunities. There's a lot of retail in this area. A lot of destination retail draws a lot of trips. The idea here is to balance that a little bit, have more of a balance between residential and other uses. So there's some changes in a few places at that waterfront district along the Crabtree, along Six Forks Road, allowing some of those properties right along that busy road to transition to low scale office uses potentially. Along this is St. Albans Drive and Bush. This is the northern end of a fairly industrial area. So one thing that we heard during the process or learned during the process from some market research is a dropping demand for some of these heavy industrial uses, but a lot of demand for housing. So looking at a way to accommodate that in the future. Along Wake Forest Road and Bland, the plan envisions becoming more of a walkable main street in this part of Midtown, which does not have one. So allowing a little bit more commercial uses along Bland in the future. And again, these are not rezonings. This would be something that if someone in the future chooses to redevelop or rezone, this is a guide for that. And then lastly, this actually simply reflects some current conditions, a change from what we call moderate density residential to a slightly higher residential category. These are existing apartment buildings and townhouses. That simply matches really what already exists on the ground. And then lastly, in summary, there are some overall guides for height in the area. And what you see here, and I can go through this in more detail, is the highest heights that the plan looks at are in that core North Hills area where they already exist. Some 20-story buildings in North Hills and a very small amount of blue, which is 20 stories on the other side of Six Forks, across from those existing 20-story buildings, and a little bit along the belt line as well. So keeping that core where the tallest heights are fairly small. The purple is more of a mid-rise building, 7 to 12 stories, and then everything else drops down from that. And then if you see the yellow, that's where it's 3 stories maximum height, which is actually the height allowable in all the city's zoning districts. So ensuring, I talked about that graceful transition to residential areas, ensuring that there is not a very abrupt 12-story to 3-story transition, which we would want to avoid. So next steps and a little bit of contact information. The Planning Commission will be reviewing this plan next week, Thursday at 4 p.m. You can comment in person, and to do that, there's a sign up on the Planning Commission's website. Just search Raleigh Planning Commission, or you can send an email. Simply communicate with them that way, planning.commission@raleighnc.gov. Once the Planning Commission makes a recommendation, that could take one meeting or a couple meetings. It will go to City Council, which will hold a public hearing on this. And then once there's an adopted plan, implementation begins. So obviously the city has been affected budgetarily by COVID, but there's going to be a capital budget and there are some important projects in this plan. And I think there will be some resources to begin implementation. And so lastly, if you have more questions or want to go in more into detail about something, you can contact me. Here's my contact information, and I'm happy to answer questions, not just tonight, but at any time going forward. So with that, we'll open it up to questions, and Hannah and I will take turns addressing these. We have some that came in previously. We're going to take those first, and then we'll take questions as they continue to come in.
Yeah, great. Yeah. I already have a queue of questions. We have one about the Benson Drive extension and the implementation of that and the land use. So as Jason mentioned in his presentation, those are dependent on redevelopment of those properties and what happen as that redevelopment happens. The designation of that extension on the street plan, which is sort of how it's integrated into city plans, is a 2-lane undivided avenue. The future, and it looks like we're gonna share a map to show some of the future land use designations in that area. This is an area where there's proposed to amend the future land use map, so the policy guidance about future land use. There's an area that currently has a portion of it is office and residential mixed use designation, and another portion is medium density residential. And then on the other side of the land is a commercial mixed use designation. And so the proposal is to extend that commercial mixed use a little ways over to where that Benson Drive extension would be.
Thing I'll address, there were a couple questions, good questions about the Benson Drive extension. So there's a couple separate pieces of Benson Drive. Right now, there's the piece that runs in between St. Albans and Navajo. And there's another disconnected piece a little bit north of there that runs a short distance and stops. And so the plan recommends ultimately extending Benson Drive to connect those two pieces. And over the longer term, continuing to extend it. And this would be as these properties redevelop. As I mentioned, it's not something where the city would ram this through some existing set of buildings, but ultimately extending it all the way north and tying back into Wake Forest or Falls and News Road around Bland. And I know the question might be, well, what is the point of that? And that goes back to the slide that I showed about creating a more connected grid system. What we see and what I know that you've experienced is, especially during busy times, Wake Forest and other major roads in the city can get very busy. And that's, again, because the road system that we have now tends to focus all those trips on those relatively small number of major roads. When you can create more alternatives, more of a grid system, it disperses that. It takes the load off those intersections. It gives people different paths they can take. And then importantly, for that theme of walkability, it means that I can get from point A to point B without necessarily having to walk along Wake Forest Road. I can walk along a 2-lane Benson Drive in a much more comfortable way, I think, for most people than traveling along Wake Forest. A couple of questions about some, less about the plan, but about some pending developments that I'll address. Actually in that same area that we're talking about. So one about a proposal for the Coastal Credit Union to build a new headquarters building at the intersection of Wake Forest and St. Albans. So there is a pending rezoning that's being, it's going through that process right now. It has not been approved. So that's still up in the air. The plan does not have any specific recommendations for that. It doesn't change any of the recommendations for height or land use right there. So it remains to be seen the outcome of that process. Also a question about a planned senior housing development along St. Albans. This is something I think there was some discussion about a few years back. That project, to my knowledge, has not actually started construction. They went through a rezoning process and a site plan process, and they have, I think, everything that is needed to begin, but have not yet started construction. And that would be at this one section of Quail Hollow and St. Albans. And Quail Hollow does not continue through to connect to St. Albans, and the plan does not recommend that. And one thing, actually, a broader note I would make about development is, particularly in this moment, it is very likely that some projects will be put on hold for some time. There's a lot of questions about the future of how we work, where we work, and how we shop and where we shop. And I think that's probably going to lead to some uncertainty. So it probably feels like there's been a lot of change here, and there will continue to be, but I think some of that is going to likely slow, at least for a few years.
Mm-hmm. Did you have any other questions?
I think a couple more questions that came in, and then we can open it up. One question is about that multimodal bridge across the Beltline. Exactly, I think the question is exactly where it will connect and how that will work. So going back to the map, and this is a big part of that disconnected street network. So right now, Church at North Hill Street is being extended, but won't connect. This is a creek right here, and there's some pretty steep slopes. This is the end of Navajo Drive. And a big need for handling transportation demand is providing, again, some alternatives. So the plan in the end connects a couple different streets here to create two parallel streets to 440, and then connects them both with this bridge, which would cross beginning at Barrett and then cross across the creek here. And this may be one location where, depending on the exact alignment of the bridge, there may be a need to acquire some property. And that's something, again, it would be determined by that alignment, but that's something where the need for that connection to serve this transportation network is pretty high. So that would be that kind of factor in that determination. But what that does, again, it creates a parallel to 440 on the north side, and by connecting to Waketown, a parallel on the south side, and takes a lot of the load off of those two interchanges at Six Forks and Wake Forest. So do we have some questions still coming in?
Yes, we do. We have a question about the proposed street plan amendment, Six Forks and Sandy Forks Road. Keeps what went into the choice of this particular location and timing of construction. Yeah, so I think it's another one that would happen as development happens. This is, if I'm right, talking about a proposed Main Street designation that would connect Sandy Forks and Six Forks Road. And Jason, you are still sharing your screen. So we don't need to go into public input inception there. Yeah, so this would happen as development happens. It's another way to sort of start building the grid in the Midtown area. And then the questions about being able to view the Six Forks portion currently. Yeah, so the materials we have are a draft report. Will be finalized once it goes through Planning Commission and City Council review.
I think I can add a little bit.
Sure.
Question and that question at the same time. It may be referring to the plans for Six Forks Road itself and the widening. I know that second question about property owners, when would they be told that they might lose some property, is about that widening. So the Six Forks corridor study mainly looked at how that road ought to work in the future. And the final recommendation was to widen that to 6 lanes, to add some much wider sidewalks and spaces for people walking and biking, and a tree line median. And the next step after that planning process was to do a much more detailed engineering study to come up with some final designs. The city hired a consultant to do that earlier this year, and there will be some public input opportunities as a part of that process, including, and I know there have not been final determinations that will come as part of that design and engineering work about where there will be some property acquisition that is needed. I know that will be part of that project. In some places, the corridor is fairly wide and there's plenty of right of way to accommodate that. In other places, it's more narrow. And so to realize that would take some acquisition. So anyone along that corridor where there's going to be some acquisition is going to receive some notification about that and be invited to participate in some of those planning processes that are specific to that future street widening. I think we addressed the next question. What's the reason for running another road parallel to Bland and Benson, and why extend Memory Road through the shopping center across Falls? That's again, going back to that concept of creating more of a grid. It's an essential part of making sure that the infrastructure here can meet that future transportation demand. I'll take the next one, and then Hannah, maybe you can take the one after that. So the question, please justify the designation of 20-story buildings along North Hills and how that road becomes a more urban street. So maybe I addressed that already during the presentation, but that's the idea that where there's some existing, and it may be helpful to switch back to a map here, but where there's some existing similarly scaled buildings at North Hills, that's where that recommendation is for some additional similarly scaled buildings on the other side. So actually, so it applies to this portion of North Hills, and which currently is zoned for 12 stories. So what the recommendation is to, again, allow that to match the height that's on the other side, which is 20 stories. But I would note, and there was some discussion about this during the earlier Six Forks corridor study, that had recommended 20 stories across this entire area. And we heard some negative feedback on that. So actually the recommendation is to scale that down so that the 20 stories is confined to along Six Forks and the interstate and ramp, but as it goes towards Lassiter Mill to scale that height down.
So that's a good segue to the next question, which was how much was changed after the last phase of public meetings and what made it in. So like Jason said, there were definitely a few instances where we had some negative feedback and adjusted the recommendations accordingly. There were also some places where we had several options for example, like connections, so behind the hospital near Bush Street, we had several street connection options and heard pretty strongly that one was preferred. The roundabout recommendation was preferred over the other. So that I'd say there, definitely plenty of influence from the public there. Next question is about updates to floodplain mapping and how that has affected the planning.
I can jump in on that one. Pretty technical question. Somebody's definitely following that process. So there are floodplain maps, and actually I will pull that up. By the way, if you're watching this and looking at this mapping tool, it's amazing. There's so much information packed into it. It's called iMaps. If you search for Raleigh iMaps, you can get there, and there's information about zoning, planning, floodplains, and so on. So there's a lot of floodplain along the Crabtree, and then this is the big branch. This is where the Greenway runs. And interestingly, so those updated FEMA maps actually diminish the size of this floodplain. It doesn't go away, but it gets a lot smaller, and you may be wondering why. And the reason is that when they were created, there were some different assumptions about what would happen upstream, specifically around Umpstead, that might become something other than what it is today, which is, in addition to being an amazing park, it's a really great stormwater retention facility, if you will. And so those floodplains are actually diminishing. Didn't really affect the plan, but it's of note in terms of what might happen in that area, because there are much tougher city rules for floodplain and floodplain adjacent development.
Mm-hmm. Then there's a question about the boundary, clarifying the boundary area of the study. So yeah, the northern boundary of this particular Millbrook Road, with the exception of that Six Forks Road area. So it does go up to Lynn Road.
Question about the Six Forks extension. That's a good question. Another key transportation recommendation here, again, part of remedying that very fragmented transportation grid in the area. So I'm not sure if I should really do this because I noticed there's some lag, but I'm going to try to draw a little line here. So this is the intersection of Six Forks and Atlantic, and Six Forks does continue a little bit further to the east, but it stops. And so the recommendation is to continue that on to connect with Capitol Boulevard. And that does a lot of things in terms of transportation. Anytime you can create that additional connection and option, it just takes the load off other places. And there were a couple questions about the impact. This is crossing over a creek and some floodplain. It's actually probably smaller than you would think. This would not be filled in to create that connection. In fact, that's the reason why it hasn't happened, because it's frankly somewhat expensive. It will require a bridge. So in terms of touching the ground there, it's actually only going to be in a small number of points. And there is the possibility, this is state property here. There is the possibility, depending on exactly where this goes, actually it's not a possibility, it would need to happen to acquire some of this land to make that connection. It actually creates the possibility of increasing the amount of pervious surface compared to the current condition. So I do not think that it would negatively affect that area and would create a really valuable transportation connection. And it's worth noting that when a transportation improvement like that can be made and facilitate a more urban place like this, being able to work well, that can take the demand off of development that might otherwise go on the far fringes of the region and take up a lot more space and create much more impervious surface than the very small amount that this bridge would create.
So there's a question about the Midtown ring, clarifying if that would be existing roads or new road extensions. Maybe you can, Jason, bring up the image of the Midtown ring.
So,
Have an image of the Midtown ring, Jason? You can.
I do, yeah. Sorry, a little delay on my end. Appreciate your patience here. I assume you're being patient. I can't hear you. You could be very impatient, but I do.
Also by email had a question about Green Street designs and when and how those would be identified.
I'm sharing the screen now.
Right, so the ring is made up of existing streets that would be designated as green streets, some greenways, obviously the new bridge, pedestrian bridge, well, both bridge projects. You have to remind me, Jason, are there any portions of this that don't already exist on road portions?
No, the only new portions would be those two new bridges across the belt line. So otherwise it would be on either the Crabtree Greenway would be a part of it or existing streets, but where a lot of that street space is carved for people walking or biking to make it and protected from the traffic on those streets to make it safe and comfortable. Next question. There's a question about where people can get a copy of the plan. I see that one of our confirmation group members responded to that. If anybody didn't see that, there's a page on the city's website. If you search for Raleigh Midtown Plan, it will come up. There's all this information that we're going through. And I do know that some of the maps in this format are hard for folks to read. There's a lot more detail there. And if you have questions about something that wasn't clear, then I definitely want to hear about it either now or you can reach out to me directly. There was a question about the waterfront park. I want to make sure that I get it. Isn't a lot of the land along the waterfront park currently subject to flooding? Yes, and that's a lot of the theory of the park itself, that it is not designed to be a place with a lot of features that will be damaged if it floods. It's designed to be very natural. Some of the examples that I showed, in fact, this is actually a good example right here of what that could look like. This is in Charlotte. So you have a greenway path, you have a lot of impervious surfaces, very stormwater absorbing surfaces. A couple more examples of what this kind of place can look like. So it's very deliberately designed to be something that's resilient, and actually beyond that provides a broader benefit by absorbing some of that stormwater. Here's a question, or it's more of a statement, but it seems that planning is for the benefit of development without regard to the impact on those that live here, and already know this to be a fairly well connected and walkable area. Well, to the second part, that's not what we heard during the process. People really express a great deal of concern about the difficulty of being able to walk. Certainly on just from around one neighborhood street to another, that's probably pretty comfortable. But to get to destinations becomes very, very difficult and uncomfortable. And that's what we heard. And then the second point, it is planning to accommodate what we're experiencing in Raleigh and the region, which is that this is a magnet for people. Again, coming here for opportunities, for employment. There are a lot of cities in North Carolina and nearby states, a lot of rural areas where jobs are drying up. And those folks are looking for the opportunity to make a better life for themselves. And they're coming to places like Charlotte and like Raleigh. And it's very, very hard to fault anybody for doing that, or for simply wanting to move to a community that's very diverse and welcoming. And so what that means is it is happening and not something that we can turn off. It means thinking pretty carefully about how we can accommodate that in a way that works for everybody, for existing residents, future residents, children who are going to grow up and probably stay here. So it's complicated and it involves some trade-offs, but that's what this planning process was designed to address.
I'm not seeing any new questions coming in. We'll check in, see if we have any calls.
One question about Midtown Exchange. Midtown Exchange has been approved for 20 stories. Is that correct? Yes, it is. And let me go back to the map again so I can illustrate where that is. So that is the name for a rezoning that it took place a couple of years back. This is St. Albans Drive, Benson, Navajo for these parcels. And it does allow 20 stories in the heart, for lack of a better word, of this area. And it steps down as it goes north toward St. Albans, I believe, to 4 or 5 stories along St. Albans. That hasn't begun yet, but again, that zoning is in place and I don't have any information about the timeline. That's probably a fairly long-term project, at least to complete that build out. but it does go to that a couple of things that we've talked about previously, which is the connection of Benson Drive. So if you think about it, you can start to see how there currently are only a couple ways in and out. And this applies to so many parts of Raleigh, but good example here. Whereas connecting Benson Drive starts to provide more opportunities. Connecting the bridge across the Beltline, same thing. The connection from Navajo to Church at North Hill, same thing. So again, trying to create that street network that's more flexible and resilient in the future. Question about the green streets. How effective are they at handling stormwater? Seems like a question about would they not be effective? Are they unattractive and expensive? I think attractiveness is definitely an eye of the beholder kind of question. I think I can show some examples earlier from the slideshow. Cost, yes, there is some cost to that. Make sure that you're seeing the green street. There is some cost to those kinds of projects, but that goes really directly to what we heard in this project. That I think for people for whom stormwater is not an issue, it's not an issue. You don't think about it too much, but for those who it is an issue, it's pretty serious and worthy of some pretty significant investments. And that's what these are designed to do. And it's something that we've used in other locations, and they can be very effective at basically diverting stormwater from where we don't want it to go. What we did when we created these streets, particularly some of these very wide streets like Quail Hollow, Bush Street, it's a lot of pavement. And these green streets, and it's something that our stormwater department has been involved in designing in some other locations. They are very effective. So is it worth the cost? I think it is if this is an important issue to people, which we know it is.
I have a question about new road at Millbrook 6 Forks, Tralee. Yeah, so that would connect Tralee to 6 Forks. It's a recommendation to add the 2-lane undivided road to the street plan. I don't know if Jason, you're headed towards a map.
I am. Everything is a little bit delayed, but I will pull up that map.
Yes. Right, so right at the intersection, I'm looking at the right one.
Yeah, it's coming. It's catching up with you.
Okay. Guess I'm not. I think I actually see it. Northeast of the intersection of Millbrook and 6 Forks Road, where there's the little pedestrian symbol. That rounded corner of a connection there. And it's kind of hard to see the base map on this, but it's an area with a lot of dead end roads, not a whole lot of grid. So again, this is going back to the ways to make connections that increase the network in the area.
Next question, not specifically about that location, but sort of similar. Will there be any help for so-called cut-through streets as traffic increases Actually, two responses to that. One, that goes back to that concept of green streets and how they can do multiple things at once. So absorbing stormwater is one of them, providing a safe, comfortable place for people to walk and bike is another. But slowing down cars and making it potentially less attractive as a street that people might travel through is another part of that recommendation. So again, I keep mentioning it. It's probably the best example, but Quail Hollow, it's wide, speeds, I know, I've witnessed them, can get pretty high, especially on some of those hills. Wide roads encourage that. The road, for whatever reason, was designed for fairly high speeds. It may have been designed with the intent that it becomes more of a major connection, but that's not what this plan envisions. It's not what we've heard people would find a reasonable trade-off. So instead, the plan recommends kind of taming that traffic. And on other streets, again, I've mentioned Quail Hollow a few times, but there's some other streets where as development continues, there could be that increased amount of traffic. So Hardemont, Bush, Waketown. So these recommendations are designed to meet that head on. I mentioned two parts to that answer. The second part is we're entering a little bit of an age of uncertainty when it comes to transportation in COVID. And we've seen a pretty significant drop in trips across the region. And of course, I don't have a crystal ball for knowing when that returns, but what we are seeing, I think we've all been seeing this, is that this has accelerated a couple of trends that were beginning to occur. Working from home and shopping online. Working from home, that's something that maybe some of us did a little bit here and there. I think it's something that a lot of us are doing full time now. And while I think some of us are realizing that while there's some benefits to working from home, it's not always the easiest thing. I think it's likely to stay. I can envision a future where there's a lot of Fridays and Mondays or just some flexibility there. And similar with online shopping, it's really accelerated that trend. So a lot of analyses out there speculating that we may not ever see the level of transportation demand again that we had seen, just because it's accelerating some of these societal shifts. Now, that doesn't mean, we've just talked about a lot of transportation improvements. It doesn't mean that these don't have a justification. Because one, there's just still is a lot that is happening and will likely continue to happen in a specific area. And two, virtually none of these projects are designed just to move cars around. They are designed to do multiple things, and primarily going back to that theme of walkable Midtown to create that better, more comfortable, safe environment for people to be able to walk to some destinations. So even if, and that's crystal ball land, even if those traffic volumes don't come back up, there still is a strong rationale for some of these projects.
We had a question about accessing these materials. Just address, so the project page, there's a few things posted there. The report, including a big picture report, which is a sort of higher level summary of that. Also find, I think these documents that Jason is sharing now, the one of the comprehensive plan amendments, which is part of what Planning Commission will be looking at. And then, Jason, I don't know if you're gonna add your slides to the project page, but that is also something we could do.
Yes, we will add those in the next day or two. And there are some similar materials that are already on there. In fact, if you have a chance, I would recommend looking at the project report. We've split it up into two parts. So there's one that's pretty technical and detailed if you want to dive into that. But there's one, it's smaller. It's called The Big Picture, and it's a lot of images and graphics. I actually think that's the best way to convey a lot of this, as long as you're also kind of showing your work and getting into the details. But you can flip through that in a couple minutes and it conveys, I think, a lot of these concepts that we've talked through tonight. And I see the project page has gotten posted. A couple more questions coming in. I'm really appreciating all these questions, and a note about the original design of Quail Hollow. More questions about the Six Forks extension and the impact on the floodplain there. It's certainly an important consideration. Absolutely, I don't mean to downplay that. And there would be some study as part of that, because the desire would be to minimize clearly any impact on natural resources there. A question about, did the planners on this project walk the neighborhoods? And answer is yes, both as a part of this project to make sure that we understood the area where this work was happening. And I can say just on a personal level, I've kind of informally, I've dragged my kids out here to walk across Six Forks and what does that feel like, and get their opinions on how does this work. And we really want to understand places from the perspective of someone who uses it. And we can't always do that fully. And that's why we have to get input from the public, but we do try also to experience these places for ourselves as well.
And just to clarify, we talked about materials a little early on. Yes, we will post the presentation to the project page.
Also a question about similar kind of green streets approach, or at least traffic calming on North Hills Drive at West Millbrook. So it's a good question. It's out of the area that was studied as part of this project. It says there are cars traveling in excess of 45 miles an hour. I don't doubt that. That's a really similar kind of street to Quail Hollow and similar kind of speeds. It certainly may be that the Green Streets approach is a good fit for that area as well. Can be something to explore. That's something I would encourage you to let City Council know, and we are making note of this as well. So that's a good question. Just so y'all know, as the questions come in, sometimes they scroll down. So I'm kind of scrolling up to make sure that we haven't.
There's one about pedestrian or bike infrastructure on St. Albans, east of Wake Forest Road.
Yeah, good question. Illustrate that on screen. Not something that I had talked about a lot. So I'm going to pause for a second. My screen is showing that, but it takes a minute, I think, for what you're seeing to catch up. So the question is about this part of St. Albans that connects from Wake Forest. You're still not seeing it, are you? To New Hope Church Road. I've highlighted it there. And so that is important too, both important from a bicycle pedestrian point of view, and again, that grid and resiliency point of view. So the plans for St. Albans, not a radical change there. It's, well, from a pedestrian perspective, actually it is. So the plans are that this would become a 2-lane street with a turn lane, a couple bush and Tar Heel, where you have some turning movements. That also allows for a median in other locations where you don't have turns, and also sidewalks. I actually walked this part of St. Albans a few months back, and it was extraordinarily uncomfortable, and I would not do it again if I had the choice, frankly. So sidewalks on both sides and some degree of bicycle facility likely as well. That's fairly standard with any new street improvement. So that would be a part of that. But yeah, pretty significant improvement and connection for people who are looking to get to the Walmart, looking to get to the hospital. It's very difficult right now because your options are Wake Forest Road, which is, it does have those facilities, but it's not everybody's ideal walk of choice. And then St. Albans, which is very uncomfortable.
Questions about sidewalks on Six Forks between I-440 and Anderson. So you're going that direction already.
So hopefully that's
checking these.
show
There's no street plan recommendation for this area, so those areas would get upgraded sidewalks likely if there was redevelopment.
right. Although one recommendation that the plan has that is somewhat relevant to that is that greenway connection. And actually I can illustrate this pretty well right here. So the intent, I talked about Quail Hollow and how that street will not continue. The street won't, but that Quail Hollow Green Street and those facilities will, as a greenway connection. And I'm going to draw this. You're going to see a blue line start to appear. I'm drawing it pretty crudely just for the point of illustration. So this is a greenway, not a street, although there also will be a street along the portion south of St. Albans. And this uses the multimodal bridge to go across 440 and connects with Barrett Drive. So someone who lives up further north on Quail Hollow Drive can take that Green Street. Actually, I sometimes like to call that an on-street greenway. Can take that, continue on the greenway south of where Quail Hollow will stop, continue south, and this is going in between the North Hills East and Midtown Exchange developments where certainly there will be a lot of activity in the future. Continues across the belt line. And at that point, there are a couple different options for where this greenway can go. And the plan recommends further study of those two options. One is to continue along Barrett Drive and along Six Forks and Anderson until it gets to the greenway. And so creating an on-street, basically a multi-use path or a very wide sidewalk. The second option involves going along Waketown, and then this is the Big Branch Creek that runs along here. And the second option is to connect that way and then across Six Forks and then to the Crabtree Greenway. So there's some complexities we heard from people during this process on their pros and cons on that. And that was going to take more study just to understand what was feasible, but also some public outreach would be helpful. That's actually one example of how, and there's many, but one of how the input that we heard in this plan shaped the recommendations. So in this case, just needing some more study before we could be confident about the best way to do that. And actually, because there was a question previously about the input and the plan, a couple other ideas that came out during the plan, maybe some of you even remember these, they got vetted and they just didn't make it. Got a lot of feedback, weren't really providing a high benefit in terms of transportation or other benefits, and a lot of concerns. So one was to extend Navajo Drive to connect to Pinecrest and then on to Wolfpack and to Hardemont, provided some benefits from a transportation perspective rather than having to go out of the way to Navajo, but it was not that big of a benefit and a lot of concern about that neighborhood. that ultimately, that didn't make it. That was one example. There was another concept, which was very creative and did have some benefits, but to make Bland Road into a 4-lane road, and shift some of the lanes from Wake Forest to Bland, but in the end, also complicated and not enough of a benefit to proceed. So some of those ideas died, and that's a good planning process, actually. When you have some ideas that make sense when you first think of them, and then when you take a harder look, they just don't work. And in the end, all the recommendations in this plan, every one, all when we got public input on them, all were favored by a majority of the participants. And actually not just a majority, but a super majority. We want to make sure that they made sense, that they serve these broader goals of improving transportation options, reducing carbon, and so on, but that they worked for the residents and the other stakeholders of the area as well. And so we know not every recommendation, not every plan is going to work for every person, but the plan did get a lot of support for all these recommendations. More questions coming in. I'm really glad, and I'm going to kind of leave it to our technical people, but my intent would be to keep going as long as we still have questions coming in, because I want to make sure that everybody gets these answered. So a couple of questions about walkability, St. Albans and New Hope, and also about Wolfpack. And so a couple of things going on here. The biggest is that there is the railroad that goes through here. And interestingly, long-term, this potentially could be some kind of passenger rail. There's been a lot of discussion about that. And I think that's a real possibility, actually, in the future. It was too long-term for this plan to really count on it. So at no point did we say, well, because there will be rail service, then this should happen or that should happen. It's a little bit further in the future, but very realistic possibility. But there are some steps that are happening now to help make that a possibility, and also just to improve current conditions. So what we have along this rail corridor are a lot of what you would have called a grade crossing. And what where you have to stop for the train when it comes. And you might get that uncomfortable feeling when you accidentally stop because the cars are lined up at the stop sign and you realize you're on the tracks. So there's one of those at Wolfpack, there's one at New Hope, actually even going further north than that, there's a few more. And so ultimately these are going to be replaced by grade separated crossings, which just means that the rail is at one level and the streets at a different level. And so cars don't have to wait on the train, the danger is reduced, and it's just an improvement overall. So in terms of the pedestrian connectivity here, it's a very awkward intersection at St. Albans and New Hope Church. That likely would be realigned a little bit as part of that project. And certainly that's actually an area where there's a lot of pedestrian activity. There's some retail, Walmart near there. And again, a place where it was designed at a time when we as a society were thinking more about driving as the only means of getting around. Didn't really do a great job thinking about people who couldn't afford cars, can't drive because they're young or maybe very old in some instances, or don't want to. And so that, like much of this plan is going back and thinking about how we can make these places work better for more people. Question about the new road near Millbrook and Six Forks and when development would begin. I don't believe there are any plans for that at the moment. A lot of those connections, and I know when you see it on a map, it looks like, oh, this is going to happen. Some of these are pretty long-term, likely. And if you think about it, it actually makes a lot of sense, and that they happen and provide that additional transportation supply when it starts to be needed, when that additional or when that redevelopment actually comes. So they have the benefit of not cutting through someone's property while they still want to use it. But then when it does get redeveloped, being able to handle that additional transportation demand. But I don't know the timeline for any specific developments at Millbrook and Six Forks. Is that all the questions that we have?
Yeah, I was checking, not seeing any coming in by email. Don't believe we have any on the phone line.
Yeah, there's nobody in the queue right now.
All right, thanks.
Okay. Is anyone still on the meeting?
Looks like we just got a new,
Yeah, there are people listening on the phone. I'm not able to see how many people are watching the stream, but there are definitely people still listening.
Did anyone want to, does anyone have another question, or did anybody want to ask a question? I don't know if we can mute or unmute participants.
It doesn't look like anyone who's on the phone right now is interested in joining the queue. I think they're just listening.
Okay, well, in that case, I'll wrap it up. I really want to thank y'all for taking part in this. These were really good questions. And I'm glad that you were able to take some time. Hope this was helpful. I want to make 2 closing points. We're going to provide this video and a general summary of what we heard in the questions to the Planning Commission. It's a lot of information. If you have a really specific point, something you love, something you don't love about the plan, then I would strongly encourage you to take part in the Planning Commission's meeting next Thursday at 4 p.m. It'll be a similar format, similar online awkwardness at times, but an opportunity for everybody to be heard. If that doesn't work for you, then you can just send that email, and that will be just as much a part of the input that they receive as people who are taking part in the meeting. And actually, I would emphasize that that's how we treat all input. It's all the same, and because it's not everybody can take the time to participate in the meeting. If someone takes part in a survey, that counts. If someone leaves a comment, that counts. So I would encourage you to do it in whichever way works the best for you. And again, if you have questions in the meantime, you can reach out to myself or to Hannah. We're both linked on that project page, and we'd be more than happy to answer any questions that you have.
All right, Jason, well, if you and Hannah are ready and there's no other questions, I'll go ahead and end the meeting.
I will say there is one, it's referring back to a question up there, and I want to see if I can find it about sidewalks on West Hillbrook.
Yeah, I kind of did the grand wrap up, but I actually want to address these questions before stop.
Trying to see if I can find the original question. Or maybe they can resend it.
One thing I can address, Hannah, while you're looking at that question about, I think it's maybe definition of on-street greenway versus protected bike lane. I did use those terms a little interchangeably, but there's a little bit of a difference. So protected bike lane, and by the way, I want to emphasize that when the city of Raleigh, and I think most cities now talk about bicycle facilities, we're no longer talking about just stripes of paint or those little shared lane markings, because what we know is that does not work for most people. That most people do not feel comfortable along even a pretty slow street with just that paint. We know that most people feel much more comfortable if there's some separation, some protection between them and the hunks of metal that are riding along beside them. And so that's the idea of a protected bicycle lane, which can be it can be a range of things. It can be some plastic posts, it can be planters, it can be raised up from the street, or it can be something even more elaborate, like what I've referred to as the on-street greenway. So I would say on-street greenway or the Green Street facility would be a type of protected bike lane, but a specific type that has essentially a strip of greenery in between someone walking or biking and the car. So a very high level of separation and how it merits that description of on-street greenway.
Thanks for resending the question. It's sidewalks on West Hillbrook. Will they be widened so that travel, bike and walk is safer to Shelley and beyond?
You're asking about Hillbrook or Millbrook?
Maybe, yeah, I was just trying to jog my memory about where that is.
I think maybe typo.
West Millbrook is maybe.
My fingers don't always do on the keyboard what I
Right.
Or so. Yeah, maybe about Millbrook.
Not finding a West Hillbrook.
So I'll just answer in general and there are a lot of these places where they're missing sidewalk sections. The Six Forks Road was a pretty good example. That's a pretty prominent one. Ultimately, those all get sidewalks. It's a question of timing. And some of these, if the need is clearly high enough, then that's going to be a city project, and there's a whole length of that road where the city will go in and install that sidewalk. In other locations, it's a little bit more development driven. So as particular development occurs, then they're responsible for constructing that sidewalk. For West Millbrook, that's actually outside of the study area, but depending on where we're looking at there, it could fall into either of those categories. But that's obviously a pretty important connection for people, and one where, again, just as with throughout the city, we want to make sure people are able to safely walk to where they're going. I think there were a few more questions.
A few comments. They did mean Millbrook. Makes sense.
I think that's it. I'll kind of pause for just a second before we kind of pull the electronic plug. A couple comments at the end. Thank you for the thank you comments. Thank you for participating in this. I recognize a lot of the names of the people on this chat and have really appreciated the opportunity to get to know many of you during this process. And one thing I know for sure is that there are a lot of people who really have a lot of love for the city of Raleigh and for this area and a lot of knowledge about it. And it's so important for us to be able to hear these voices. And just on a personal level, I appreciate getting to meet different people as part of this job. It's what makes it more than just a job for me. So thanks to all y'all who have participated.
It looks like most of the people on the phone have dropped off, so I think it's probably safe to say that we could wrap up the meeting.
Yeah.
You guys did a great job.
thanks for your help.
Yeah.
Yes, thanks.
For everyone who tuned in.
All right, I'm going to end the conference line. Thanks for joining.